Thingvellir is the most important cultural heritage site in Iceland, a national treasure and at the same time a major cultural resource at the global level. Its dramatic history from the establishment around the year 930 of the Althing, Iceland's parliament, affords a unique insight into how a pioneer community during the Viking Age first began to organize its society and took its first steps towards becoming a modern nation. Thingvellir also combines in just one place an assortment of natural phenomena, which only a handful of places on Earth can boast. To Icelanders, Thingvellir is a symbol of national unity, where the main strands of its history have been woven from its earliest settlement in the 9th century to the present day. Thingvellir National Park presents tangible and significant cultural qualities, as well as natural ones, in particular the remains of the Althing, or Icelandic General Assembly, evidence of agricultural use of the park landscape in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Thingvellir Church, as well as the population of Arctic char and Lake Thingvallavatn. Thingvellir is also rich with intangible cultural qualities, the most important of which is the Althing site, the location of Iceland's earliest parliament. The Althing reflects wider medieval Germanic notions of law and authority, and the association of the Althing site and the surrounding landscape with the notions of Icelandic identity, liberty, and natural philosophy have made it a national shrine. Thingvellir and its surroundings are of outstanding value as a geological monument as well. It is unique from a geological perspective, as the clearest example on Earth of a tectonic plate on dry land. The chief characteristic of the landscape is its fissures, the largest of which form a cliff wall and backdrop to the ancient assembly site. These fissures are part of the Thingvellir Rift Valley, formed on tectonic plate boundaries where two continental plates are moving apart. The Thingvellir Rift Valley can be seen particularly well on the surface, and was cited as an example when the theory of plate tectonics was being formulated in the 1960s. The rift is the most evident example on dry land where plate separation on a mid-ocean ridge can be perceived and understood. Thingvellir and the Lake Thingvallavatn surroundings are thus of outstanding value as a geological monument, not only for Iceland, but also globally. Thingvellir's unique nature, landscape, and cultural remains create a setting for history like the walls of a natural temple, with its cliff walls, fissures, slopes, lava fields, and grassy plains, where the river Oxara still flows, and its ruins recall ages gone by. The park creates a backdrop to all the major historical events that have taken place there. In the environment of dramatic contrast, one can sense the mystery of sacred things, at once awesome and enchanting, which contrasts and repels at the same time, arousing strong and conflicting emotions. Thingvellir is where Icelanders go when major decisions are to be made. The park is a symbol of national unity and the embodiment of the national identity. In the 19th century, when romantic notions of liberty, national identity, and national philosophy began to gain momentum, Thingvellir assumed a symbolic meaning. As a token of its importance to the Icelandic people, Thingvellir National Park was founded in 1930 as Iceland's first national park. Without doubt, for most Icelanders today, the park remains a sacred place, the locus of the national spirit. The interplay of history and nature's distinctive scenery makes it utterly unique. Iceland is geologically a young volcanic island, dating a mere 16 million years back in time. It straddles a diverging plate boundary of the mid-Atlantic ridge, with spreading zones that are characterized by a high volcanic production as a result of the ongoing hotspot activity and crustal growth. The rifts that characterize Thingvellir National Park are a corollary of this process. They are generally of low topographical expression due to the lava flows that smooth them out at intervals, hence the rarity of fault-bounded lakes nestled within them. Lake Thingvallavatn is an exception, with a pronounced low in volcanic production. This has persisted since the last interglaciation, which took place over 100,000 years ago. But at the same time, dilatation and subsidence of the rift floor has proceeded at an undiminished rate. This is the reason that the fault escarpments are higher in its surroundings than anywhere else in the spreading zone of Iceland, and are actually proportional in height to the age of the various surface lavas. Thingvellir Plain is on the western slope of a large lava shield that was formed some 10,000 years ago, shortly after the Ice Age glacier melted, and has a surface area of 200 kilometers. The lava flowed into Lake Thingvallavatn and blocked its outflow, but a sizable stretch has gradually vanished into the lake as the rift has deepened. Cultural landscape refers to a landscape on which man and history have left their mark by habitation or other kinds of activity. A landscape with a history has sometimes been compared with a vellum manuscript that has continually been scraped clean to write on it again, so that each generation has left its mark on it. Thingvellir has a unique history and is a prime example of a cultural landscape where natural remains, archaeological remains, history, and outstanding scenery give the area unparalleled value. For many centuries, turf and rock were used for virtually all man-made structures, regardless of whether they were to be used as farmhouses, outhouses, walls, or booths. Since turf is not a permanent building material, the structures needed to be regularly renovated. Material for them was probably taken locally, or even from earlier ruins, and later structures were often placed on older ruins. It is therefore not surprising to find historical remains of human habitation at Thingvellir, showing that in some locations, up to 3 or 4 layers of habitation have been built, one on top of the other. Located on an active seismic zone, the land is subject to natural change. The floor of the valley has subsided by some 3 to 4 meters since the Althing was founded at Thingvellir, and will continue to do so. Subsidence has also caused the surface of the lake to extend higher into the innermost assembly site, and the level of the Oxara River has consequently risen and buried part of it under sediment. The plains where the delegates to the assembly once had their booths will therefore eventually be submerged by natural processes. The faults and fissures of the Thingvellir Rift have grown incrementally. Measurements over the past 40 years show a latent creep of about 3 millimeters per year extension and 1 millimeter vertical displacement of the rift zone. However, short rifting events involving extension and subsidence of a few meters also occur. One event is known from historical times. It occurred in the spring of 1789 and lasted for 10 days. The subsidence then measured 2.5 meters in the middle of the rift. The rain that falls on the lava takes 2 to 4 months to enter the lake. South of Thingvellir is Thingvellir, the largest high-temperature area in the country. There, water heats up underground by contact with hot rock and is forced up through the crevices and faults under Mount Hengel. Reykjavik Energy has harnessed the high-temperature area to heat cold water for household heating with low-pressure steam and drill hole water, and it also generates electricity using high-pressure steam. The land within the national park has changed little since Iceland was settled. Soil erosion and subsequent vegetation and forest deterioration have been some of the most important environmental issues in Iceland for centuries. Subsequently, soil reclamation and forestry have been seen as the most important measures that can mitigate these problems, as well as a gesture of respect towards Thingvellir. The first conifers to be planted in Iceland were planted there in 1899. At that time, it was considered environmentally acceptable to plant any kind of tree, and priority was given to identifying types that would grow quickly. Planting of these conifers has therefore to some degree altered the original natural environment, and such action is regarded with circumspection today, although it was thought to improve the environment 100 years ago when it was started. The Institute of Archaeology in Iceland, on behalf of the Thingvellir Commission, has undertaken archaeological excavation at Thingvellir. Excavations were carried out at selected district assembly sites around the country between 2002 and 2006. The objective of the research was to obtain new sources of information on the history of Thingvellir and assembly sites in Iceland, given that the information currently available is largely based on conjecture. The value of the project lies in the new information on Iceland's cultural history that was attained, for the benefit of students, tourists, and anyone interested in Icelandic history. Numerous remains associated with habitation and daily toil, as well as archaeological ruins connected with the functions of the ancient assembly, have been preserved at Thingvellir. Outhouses, sheep pens, and the ruins of abandoned farmhouses are still visible on the surface and can be found throughout the area. Indeed, the Thingvellir National Park contains well-preserved remains of dwellings from the 18th and 19th centuries, which present an outstandingly comprehensive picture of the cultural landscape in the days before the mechanization of agriculture. The remains of farms, tracks, and grassy fields found within the national park form an interesting whole and offer a fascinating insight into agricultural practices and ecology in past centuries. Walls, turf and rock structures, and farm sites have been preserved from an age before mechanization was introduced into agriculture. The place names of Thingvellir are evidence, above all, of the highly varied activities that have taken place there through the ages, as a centre of Iceland's government. Legislative and judicial assemblies, including executions, religious rites, and not least animal husbandry, as well as the everyday life of the inhabitants for more than 1,000 years. It is not known when Thingvellir was first settled. Place names tell us nothing about the farms in the Bláskógabyggð or Blue Woods area prior to the days of the Althing, but after its foundation the estate was known as Thingvellur, the assembly plain, according to the Book of Icelanders, as the first book written about Icelandic history is known. The Thingvellir farm has probably always been located on the same site as the present-day farmhouse. The oldest description of the farm dates from 1678. Old drawings show that the farm's front gables face south, with its front facade in line with the south gate of the cemetery. The farm buildings were made from turf and rock until 1880, when the turf buildings were gradually replaced by wooden ones. The history and development of the area is linked to the Viking Age. The Viking Age was an eventful period in the history of the Nordic peoples, and has even been linked with Nordic folk migrations. Its beginning is generally dated from a raid made by the Vikings on the monastery of Lindisfarne in northern England in the year 793, and its conclusion is marked by the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. During the intervening period, great numbers of people left their homes to seek new places to live, in areas spreading from the banks of the Volga River to the east coast of North America, and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Ocean. Never before or since have Nordic peoples had as much influence over other populations. Vikings are widely imagined to be brutal raiders, but we must not forget that many others were peace-loving farmers who sought new places to live, and not least merchants who promoted trade between different countries and cultures. Vikings settled in many areas of Europe and established colonies, but these were small in population and were soon assimilated by the earlier residents, with the result that their influence was only indirect. The expansion of the Vikings westward to the islands of the North Atlantic was quite another story. Since these territories were unsettled, the Nordic settlers could build up societies completely on their own premises. These societies are believed to have lasted for several centuries. Nordic societies of this period were governed on the one hand by an assembly of free and armed men, and on the other by a leader generally referred to as a king. This was the same arrangement as prevailed among other Germanic peoples. Laws were adopted at the assemblies, judgments passed, and other issues in the society settled. The king would take the lead in times of war, but had little power in other respects. Lake Thingvellir, with a surface area of 83 square kilometers, is the largest natural lake in Iceland. The lake's biosphere clearly testifies to the fact that it straddles the border between the continents of Europe and America. Thingvellir National Park contains well-preserved remains of dwellings from the 18th and 19th centuries, which present an outstandingly comprehensive picture of the cultural landscape in the days before the mechanization of agriculture. The large number of remains of farms, tracks, and grassy fields found within the national park form an interesting whole and offer a fascinating insight into agricultural practices and ecology in earlier times. Walls, turf and rock structures, and farm sites have been preserved from an age before mechanization was introduced into agriculture. A remarkable feature in the history of Thingvellir is that the inhabitants of a whole community there changed their religion in a peaceful process at the Althing in the year 1000. The conversion of Iceland from paganism to Christianity was approved by the Althing in 1000 and was remarkable for how peacefully this important change was achieved. It also shows how the administrative structure of the Althing functioned at this time, with unanimous approval needed in order for matters to be resolved. The oldest and most reliable source on the adoption of Christianity is the Book of Icelanders by Ari Thorgilsson the Wise. It is believed to have been written around 1130, or a little more than a century after the events at Thingvellir. Ari the Wise had access to people closely related to those who had personally experienced the events at Thingvellir about 100 years before. The first church at Thingvellir was built soon after Iceland's conversion to Christianity. The early 13th century Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson described how King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway, who assumed the crown in 1015, sent timber to Iceland, and a church was then built at Thingvellir. There has been a church at Thingvellir ever since. It is believed that the churches at Thingvellir have always been made of wood. The present-day church was built in 1858, and in 1907 a new tower was built. It seats just over 40 people and is simply adorned in the traditional Icelandic style. Several place names in Thingvellir refer to the church and clergy: Church Field, Bell Hillock, Bell Path, Priest's Corner, Priest's Meadow, Priest's Islet, and Bishop's Hillocks. The principal archaeological remains are in the area where the Althing assembled. Archaeological remains are also found in various other places, and there are ruins of deserted farms within the national park. Much archaeological research has been carried out at Thingvellir. Researchers have studied the locations of places and events in saga literature, surveyed old sites, made maps, and published their findings. The oldest description of historical remains at the park dates from 1700. It describes the site of the Law Council in 18 Bús. Later, in the 18th century, more descriptions of the assembly site were published, including the locations of the booths of leading officials at that time. In addition to these descriptions, 3 maps of Thingvellir are extant from the 18th century, and one from the 19th. The oldest dates from about 1781. Thingvellir was included on the list of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites in 2004. The site offers a unique reflection of medieval Norse and Germanic culture, one which persisted in essence from its foundation in the year 980 until the 18th century.